Everybody for being here today. Welcome to Newport. I think we have a fantastic venue. I know we have a fantastic lineup of speakers and panelists for today. So I want to make sure that everybody's situated well. We're working on trying to get the temperature down in the room a little bit. It's a tad warm, but we'll see if we can do something about that. In the meantime, I want to go ahead and turn it over to Will Sauer, who's the current president for WIRES, for him to give some welcoming and introductory remarks, and then also to introduce our welcome video, and then our keynote speaker. So Will, go ahead and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Larry. Welcome to the WIRES Summer Conference of 2022. I'm William Sowers, as many of you know, WIRES president for this year. Most importantly, welcome to Newport. Welcome to New England as well. And in some places, this is the absolute perfect place to hold this conference. Newport is a city with a rich history. As everybody has seen, the Naval War College is down the road. The Naval War College is the home of thought for the Navy and has been since 1883. And what's important about the Navy is they're really the tip of the spear when it comes to adapting to climate change. And I am proud of the hard work that a lot of the WIRES members in this room have done, as well as my own company, Duke Energy, in working closely with our armed forces in a changing world to ensure their continued resilience and readiness. Newport is also a city with a rich sailing history. As many of you know, Newport is kind of the unofficial sailing capital of the world, and it's home of the National Sailing Hall of Fame. And for some of us, those might be fighting words, especially those from Maryland and Annapolis specifically. Annapolis was the former home of the Sailing Museum up until a couple years ago. And now it's in Newport. But let's focus on the wind and the resource. And the wind that makes this area so great for sailing is the wind that's also capable of harnessing energy and electricity. And as we all know, just kind of a short distance from where we sit now at the Hotel Viking is Block Island. Block Island is the wind farm is the first commercial wind farm in the United States. It's really what brought offshore wind to the United States. But for anyone knows who has worked in offshore wind knows that really a thoughtful approach to transmission development to bring power onshore to integrate in the grid is really what's just as important as all the thought and care that's provided and exactly where to site the wind turbines as well. And that's really where WIRES is so vital is on that transmission side. I also want to recognize the region, New England. New England, in my mind, is also one of the perfect places to hold this conference. It's a region that has grappled with long transmission lines for quite a while and to integrate renewable resources. Some of these have resulted in success stories, some have resulted in lessons learned. But it's a region where you have states that are vibrant, industrious, and diverse. And they're all different. And this reflects really the dynamic of building transmission today by the kind of importance of working closely with individual states, with stakeholders, and by embracing the kind of dual jurisdiction of federal and state. Most importantly, welcome to the WIRES conference of summer 2022. And what a conference will be. Very excited to have our keynote speaker, Gordon. And although Gordon is clearly from a place that's decidedly not in New England, he has really helped the region thrive and embraced its culture. We'll have a panel on offshore wind, again from the state that has brought us offshore wind. And we'll have a panel on FERC's long-term transmission planning NOPR or proposal. I am excited and thank you all for joining us. But first I'd like to turn to our introductory welcome. And this is a message from a veteran United States Senator with an incredible passion for our industry. And we've seen that passion in the urgency and determination he has brought to fight climate change. Now, this US Senator has recently had a 10-year streak of speaking on the Senate floor, urging his colleagues that it was time to wake up to fight climate change. And with every speech, which again was every week no matter what, a green board would accompany him. And on that green board was a picture of the earth and the phrase, "It's time to wake up." And as you can imagine, after 10 years, that board became pretty tattered and battered, and he even used those words, tattered and battered. Now, on one particular milestone, one of my former bosses printed a new board, a brand new board that was not tattered or battered anymore for the senator to use. But as you can imagine, when you start a campaign, when you begin a campaign, sometimes you have to carry it through and carry it through in the manner that it began. So, and on some occasions, the senator will still bring that board to the floor and provide his message to the Senate that it's time to wake up. And with this introduction, it's my pleasure to introduce Senator Sheldon Whitehouse for his recorded welcome message for our opening meeting.
Sheldon. Hi, this is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. I'm very glad to see Wires come to Newport for your 2022 summer meeting. Welcome. You are going to have a wonderful time. This is a great time of year to visit Rhode Island, so I hope you take time to see the sights and enjoy beautiful Narragansett Bay. Solar and wind projects have grown across the country, which is good news for our planet and for consumers. One of the things we do well here in Rhode Island is offshore wind. In fact, we solved the puzzle of offshore wind siting, and it's exciting to see our state become a hub for an emerging industry. This year, our General Assembly passed historic legislation requiring a market-competitive procurement to be issued for between 600 and 1,000 megawatts of newly developed offshore wind capacity. Rhode Island continues to lead the way with a new law requiring the state to achieve a 100% renewable energy standard by 2033. America can lead the world in reaching our climate goals and cutting emissions, but that will require real public and private investment and a lot of new transmission infrastructure. Right now, over 900 gigawatts of clean energy wait to connect to the grid. The Biden administration has set a goal to install 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. In order to see all this energy reach our homes and businesses, we need to close the transmission gap. Our expanded grid also needs to be resilient, so communities aren't subject to dangerous extended outages as the extreme weather effects of climate change pick up. And it has to be smart, as new technologies raise new opportunities. And its investors have to do the work of building support for projects in local communities. FERC has been taking a lot of action recently, including proposing improvements to transmission planning, new methods to allocate transmission project costs, updates for connecting generation projects to the grid, and measures to better understand and account for the impacts of extreme weather on the grid. DOE is moving forward under the bipartisan infrastructure law to implement a number of programs, including the $2.5 billion transmission facilitation program to build out transmission lines across the country, the largest infrastructure law investment in solely transmission. And the $2.3 billion grant program to strengthen and modernize our grid against extreme weather with underground power lines, smart grid technologies, and other upgrades. Transmission investment can help us avoid the worst of the climate crisis and deliver clean, reliable energy to American homes. Wires and its members can help lead the way, and I want to do whatever I can to encourage you. Thank you, and enjoy your Rhode Island stay. This is Senator
It is with my great pleasure to introduce Gordon, the ISO New England's president and CEO. Gordon, you're distinguished among RTO CEOs for many reasons. We could point to your tenure of being the longest active serving CEO as one, but it's really more than that. It's more the interest that you've shown in transmission development. It's the importance of working through communities and really recognizing the hard work and the vital need of bringing transmission and the importance that it is to the grid. So thank you for joining us today, and appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, somebody get the presentation.
We'll put up right.
good morning. It's great to be here. I always enjoy participating and interacting with this group. We've built a lot of transmission in New England, and there's a lot more to come. And as we're getting my presentation up there, you'll see I've labeled it the 4 pillars needed for a successful clean energy transition and the critical role of transmission infrastructure. Sorry. Yeah, no worries. I'm going to take this. Thank you. Much better. So just to repeat that, the title is the 4 pillars needed for a successful clean energy transition. I'll unpack that for you during the course of the presentation. I've actually got a reasonably short deck from a content perspective, because what I really wanted to do was have a conversation with you. So Larry tells me I have about 45 minutes. I should use up about half of it with the presentation if you just let me run. But you're also welcome to stick up your hand and ask me a question on any of the slides. Without stealing any thunder from the presentation here, transmission is one of the 4 pillars. So let me just go from there and start, though, with our mission and vision statement. So our mission is hard-coded into the tariff. It really just enshrines what we do. We operate the power system, we administer the markets, and we do transmission planning. But several years ago, actually going back to 2020 now, we decided we needed a new vision statement in terms of just talking about where we're going and to be explicit about our commitment to the clean energy transition. And so we came up with this very short sentence in a way, but we think it's a very succinct way of describing how we're thinking about the future. To harness the power of competition, which is a nod to the wholesale market structure, and advanced technologies, which is what's going to help enable the clean energy transition, to reliably plan and operate the grid as the region transitions to clean energy. So, one of the debates we had at the time was whether we should, there were a lot of people pushing us, including the states, to say somehow you've got to be responsible for making the clean energy transition happen. And of course, we don't have the legal jurisdiction to do that. So the Federal Power Act doesn't give FERC the jurisdiction to do that. We don't have the jurisdiction. The states have the jurisdiction until the federal government acts. So really, we're an important stakeholder and a piece of the big machine that's going to make this happen, but we're not empowered to actually drive the clean energy transition on our own. And I've had many conversations with Sheldon Whitehouse about this. So he'd love to have us just make a 205 filing at the FERC to implement carbon pricing in our energy markets. And, of course, we can't do that. We've said to the states we'd love to do that, but we need them to authorize us to do that. So that vision statement is really driving our work plan and everything that we do. And, one of the realities here is that the grid is shifting fairly dramatically. It's shifting in 2 dimensions. It's a shift from conventional generation, conventional fossil nuclear, to renewable energy. That's the obvious one. And then also a shift from centrally dispatched generation to distributed resources. So we just went through a 6-day heat wave in New England. What was quite remarkable was that we'd have been setting new records every day through that 6-day period were not for the solar panels, 4,000 megawatts of solar panels in New England, that were actually contributing mostly behind the meter, actually, to reducing demand. So the complexity, though, of operating a system that has shifted like this is profound. And the other thing that's really causing a real issue is we've moved from a system really that was energy secure to a system that has got insecurities around energy. And the question really is, how do we solve that problem? And I'll be unpacking that in a lot more detail. So here are the 4 pillars that we sort of started talking about. I came up with this structure last winter, actually, in an exchange with Commissioner Katie Dykes of Connecticut. We were doing a letter writing campaign with each other, and it came to me that what we needed to do was have a structure to be able to explain what's needed to ensure a successful clean energy transition. So the 4 pillars are significant amounts of clean energy through the introduction of renewables, and that's pretty obvious. We need lots and lots of renewables to power the entire economy. The second one is less obvious, I think, to people, which is we need balancing resources. I coined this term balancing resources to try and talk about what this is going to look like in the future, because really renewables become the base load energy source in the future. I mean, it's always been this engineering term, base load, and it's referred to nuclear power and coal-fired and all the rest of it. But really, if you project out 30 years, base load is going to be clean energy. It's going to be wind turbines, and it's going to be solar energy and hydro and so forth. But it's going to have a very variable characteristic because it's tied to the weather from a production point of view. And so you need something that's going to balance that system for you day to day. And then the third pillar really is, I've called it energy adequacy, because we've moved from a world where you could rely on, because it was contracted for, energy inputs into the system that was stable. But really, in a world where you're relying on renewable energy, the energy inputs are the wind and the sun, and they're not stable, they're variable. But furthermore, what we've also discovered is some of the old energy inputs, like gas, are no longer stable, particularly in an energy-constrained system like New England, where we don't have enough pipelines to support both winter heating and the gas generation needs. And I think that will be a characteristic of pretty much any system that's on a clean energy transition. So if you look around in California, for example, those energy inputs are not necessarily always reliable. So the big question is, how do you firm that up in order to make the whole system hold together? And then the fourth pillar here is transmission. So transmission is really an enabling infrastructure. We can't make the system work without that underlying enabling infrastructure. But my point here with the 4 pillars is if any one of these pillars is weak, the whole system is weak. And if we're going to do this properly, we need to make sure that we invest in each of those 4 pillars, not just 1 or 2 of them. So just to go back here, I'm going to unpack 3, which is energy adequacy, and then transmission. And there's a linkage between these two. And hopefully that will set us up for some good discussion. So the transition slide here says long-term regional energy adequacy will depend, and I put in parentheses, in part, on additional transmission investments. There's a lot of folk that sort of wave the banner of transmission and say it's going to solve everything. But it can't, right? And we can't just fill the world with wire and think that that's going to produce energy. Transmission doesn't produce energy. It helps transport energy. And sometimes we lose sight of that. So people, when they're advocating for transmission, sort of wave it around as sort of the magic dust that you're going to sprinkle and everything's going to work out. But we also need to make sure that the energy inputs are there. And so, tying the world together with the transmission when you're facing weather systems that are thousands of miles wide and deep, like the weather system that brought Texas down in February of 21, then everybody's suffering at the same time. So you've got to make sure that you have stable energy inputs into the system, because you may not be able to lean on your neighbor. And that's, I think, a very true statement here in New England as well, because when it gets cold in Boston, it's cold in Montreal, and it's cold in Albany. Right, and so we've got to make sure that there's enough energy to go around in the entire region. So this chart just shows the shift in the energy mix. It's a very big shift that's occurred already within the last 20 years. I mean, what's really interesting is if you look here at oil and coal, it was almost 40% of our energy production 20 years ago. And the tiny little bars down here, 0.7% in total in last year. That's a dramatic shift. And with that shift has come a dramatic reduction in carbon emissions. So really, the wholesale markets and the transmission investments just to give a plug to the transmission investments we made in this region, helped achieve that result. Of course, what happened is we did it on the back of natural gas. So that's another problem today now, because we need to get off the gas over time, and a big chunk of this gas is actually coming from other parts of the world, which is a really bad move on our part. So, not surprisingly, because gas was cheap and gas combined cycles are efficient, they pushed a lot of other resources out of the market. So we've had significant retirements. Just since 2013, we've had 5,000 megawatts of retirements, which is a big number in a place like New England. And most of the retirements have been coal, oil, and nuclear. We've actually lost a couple of nuclear resources as well. This chart just sort of shows you the red dots are the ones that we think are most at risk. Typically, those are the 50, 60, sometimes 70-year-old oil-fired steam units. And the point here on the chart is that generator retirements occur on schedule, but the new resources coming in to provide the replacement energy are not coming in on schedule. They're being delayed. So the offshore wind farms are being delayed, the transmission lines are being delayed, and the consequence is ultimately that the safety margin of the system has shrunk quite dramatically, to the point now where we really will struggle to make it through an extreme winter. And that's been a concern of ours now for quite a while, and a big conversation with our stakeholders in the States. And this bottom one really bothers me. So, because of the pipeline constraints we have into the region, the pipeline system is not even sized to meet heating demand. I mean, the way we meet the peak heating demand in this region is through satellite liquefied natural gas that is filled up mainly from the Everett LNG terminal during the summertime. So we do what Europe does, actually. So just like Europe is scrambling to fill up its storage in the summertime, that's what we do here in New England. But we also built this big fleet of combined cycles on the back of a gas system that was never designed really to provide that system. It had lots of spare capacity during the summertime and the off-season, but during the wintertime, not enough capacity to supply the gas combined cycles. So a lot of those units can't get fuel in the winter when the pipelines get constrained, or those that have got dual fuel tanks switch to burning oil, or they use LNG. And so we're very dependent on imported LNG in this region. And I think it seemed like a good idea at the time, which is you could avoid the expense associated with new pipeline investments. And from an environmental point of view, I think there was a set of logic that said we're not extending the dependency on gas by building new pipelines, but it's put us into a corner now where we've become tangled in the European energy crisis. So if you look at the forwards on gas for this region, they look like the forwards in Europe. And there's a simple reason for that. It's because we're competing with Europe for the same gas. And the Jones Act prevents actually any LNG from the US actually making its way into New England. So most of the gas these days into New England comes from Trinidad, which is off the coast of South America. In the past it's come from Qatar, but they're now mainly supplying Europe. We've also had a couple of tankers of Russian gas in past years, which of course we're not going to be getting this winter. But I think that's a problem because it's driving billions and billions of dollars of costs onto consumer bills every winter. And it's also creating a reliability problem for us because there's no such thing as a firm LNG supply anymore. It's whoever's going to pay the most money for it. There's many countries today that thought they had firm LNG and the suppliers paid the liquidated damages, walked away from it, and sold the gas to Europe. So I think we're, in a reasonably good spot this winter because we've got the Mystic unit under contract. But I really do worry about, what the future looks like for the region. And so this is a big problem for us. So here's some graphics that just sort of illustrate this a little more. So this little chart here in the corner just sort of shows you the volatility on electricity and gas prices. And basically, so what the spiky chart tells you is whenever gas prices go up, electricity prices go up. No surprise. For many years, New England was the most expensive gas market in the world in the wintertime. It's no longer the case, but we're tracking Europe pretty closely, so it's not a great place to be. This particular spike over here was the winter of 17-18, when we came really close to an energy emergency. It was an above average warm winter in the winter of 17-18, and NOAA forecasted as an above average warm winter. But then we got this 2-week deep freeze in the middle of basically last week of December, early part of January, and we used an incredible amount of oil. Actually, you'll see that here. So we ended up using almost 100 million gallons of oil in a few weeks. And that was because the gas was super expensive. Oil became the more cost-effective fuel, but there was also not that much gas available to begin with. So look at what happens last winter. This is the winter of 21-22. So, what's going on in the winter of 21-22? Another mild winter, actually, with no cold snaps really to speak of. So really just a very mild winter, as was the winter before it. Actually, that winter there was the winter of 2021. The weather pattern between 2020 and 2022 was very comparable. So what's driving that big difference? LNG prices, Europe. So Putin was still starting to play his games and start throttling back gas to Europe. And what we saw was the big run-up in gas prices on the back of a mild winter. And even in a mild winter, we used 80 million gallons of oil. So when I look at that, I just think it makes no economic sense, what we're doing. But furthermore, we're creating a massive problem from a reliability point of view. This is not the system that you want to build the clean energy transition on. And we've got to fix this problem. So here's my pitch. We need transmission and other investments. So it can't just be transmission, but transmission is a very important part of this. We've made huge investments. Relative to our size, we've made $13 billion worth of investments in the transmission system in about a 15-year period, 20-year period here in New England. That's a big deal for a region the size of New England. It's got a cost associated with it as well. I think it's 2.2 cents per kilowatt hour on a retail bill. But we're going to need to spend more money on transmission to enable the clean energy transition. So it's a critical pillar for the transition. We also need to make sure, though, that we solve the energy adequacy problem. Transmission can actually help that because we can tap into other sources of energy adjacent to us, like Hydro-Quebec as an example. It's a critical enabling infrastructure to get the offshore wind up and going. So all of these things will actually help with the energy adequacy, but further than hooking into other renewable energy sources, we need to sort of stabilize the system. We need a shock absorber in the system with regard to energy supply. We've done a lot of study on this. There's been multiple studies, and there are more coming. One of the most recent ones is the Future Grid Reliability Study. If you're interested, you go have a look at it. It shows you that the energy adequacy problem gets bigger over time, not smaller over time. And that's basically because as we add more and more renewables to power the economy that's shifting towards the grid, when the renewables stop producing for a period of time, that gap has to be filled with something. And that gap gets bigger over time, not smaller over time. So the Germans are aware of this. They call this Dunkelflaute. It means dark doldrums. You know, the period in the winter when there's no sun and there's no wind. The Scandinavians, if you speak to the people at Nord Pool, the Norwegians keep 2 weeks of energy in reserve in their dams. They never touch it because they need a deal worth getting through that Dunkelflaute period. We don't have anything like that. There's no regulatory requirement. I think we need a regulatory requirement, whether it be at a federal level or at the state level, that creates that sort of energy reserve on the system. It's interesting watching what's happening in Germany right now. I didn't know this until this energy crisis. But so the German government lets the market work as long as the market ensures that gas storage levels reach 90% coming into the winter. And if that number drops below 80%, they basically suspend the market and they start allocating the gas. They start rationing it. So that's what the panic is all about in Germany right now, because Putin has throttled back the gas even further. They're at 60% storage. They don't know whether they're going to make 80 or 90% storage by the winter time. So they're really talking about rationing the gas now in order to be able to get through the winter. But what was interesting to me about that example is there's an example of a regulatory requirement that says we don't want to put our society at risk. We want to make sure the storage is filled to a certain level going into the winter. I don't see anything like that anywhere in the US. Some of it's starting to pop up. I see Governor Newsom in California now declaring an energy reserve, and he's putting really some of the old fossil units into a reserve on the side to keep them going for a while. But that's really a capacity reserve. And I think if we think about energy constrained systems in the future, which is what clean energy systems are going to look like, we need to have something that sits there as the shock absorber on the system. It's energy storage, and it can take many forms, but the amount of energy we're talking about is not going to be able to be stored in lithium-ion batteries. So the thing we've got to also realize here is that 2-hour batteries are not going to help us through a 2-week event. So we have to do something about that too. So my last point here really is that, as we think about these issues, reducing our dependence on fossil fuels will depend heavily on accelerating the clean energy transition, accelerating the integration of renewables, and accessing balancing energy supplies in neighboring regions like Hydro-Quebec. But it will also require something else to be done in terms of sort of stabilizing the energy supply. In the short run, I think that looks like stabilizing the fuel supply chains into New England. So the one other thing the pandemic has taught us in the last 2 years is supply chains matter. Whether you're talking about global chip supply or global energy supply, supply chains matter. And we've got this interesting situation where most buyers of electricity are short in the market, in part because that's the way things are regulated at state level. So people don't go further out than 6 months at a time in terms of buying their electricity. And yet we're expecting suppliers to go long. How's that going to work? It's not working very well. So I think from a regulatory point of view, we've got to think about that as well. So final part here is transmission. And of course, the clean energy transition will depend on additional transmission investments. Here's a snapshot of our system here in New England, some 9,000 miles of high voltage transmission, 13 transmission interconnections with New York and Eastern Canada, actually quite weakly interconnected, if you think about it. A few thousand megawatts of connection between New York and Canada. So not only are we at the end of the pipeline, we're at the end of the Eastern interconnection as well, and relatively weakly interconnected. Our characteristics are more like the United Kingdom. If you think about an island that has got a few transmission lines connected to mainland Europe. So we're not like PJM or SPP, where we're in the middle of the system and we're heavily connected on all sides. We're really off on the edge of the system with the ocean on one side, Canada to our north, and Hydro-Quebec is electrically isolated from us, right? So in that sense, I think when I look at our situation and how we have to think about the clean energy transition, it's a better model for us to look to are some of the European countries that are in the same situation as we do, as we are. So about 16% of our electricity needs are imported, mostly from Hydro-Quebec. And we've spent almost $13 billion. We've got $12 billion on the books, another 1.1 planned. And that was a big investment that was done really in order to strengthen the system from a reliability point of view. And of course, what's coming is lots of transmission to integrate renewables. Our interconnection study is an interesting preview of what people are planning to build. So the thing about the interconnection queue chart is you've got to take it a little bit with a pinch of salt, because only some fraction of what's shown here will actually be built. But what's interesting is to watch the trend. So this is June of 2017, not so long ago, 5 years ago. At least half of what was in our queue at that point was still gas. Of course, the wind was already starting to show up. It was the bulk of what was the balance in the queue. But look at today, gas has basically disappeared. It's this tiny little slice over here. So I don't think we're going to build new gas resources for a whole bunch of reasons. We're not going to build new gas resources in New England. And what developers are planning to build are solar, battery storage, and wind, with the bulk of the interconnection requests being wind. And then this chart unpacks that. On the right here, you can see the bulk of it really is Massachusetts and Connecticut. And then for onshore wind, there's a lot of potential up in northern Maine. So we've been doing some planning work with the states, something called the 2050 Transmission Planning Study. So the states asked us to go out beyond our 10-year planning horizon all the way out to 2050 to look at what are the implications of, from a transmission perspective, of meeting the loads that will come as we electrify the economy, as we move transportation and heating to the grid. So here's some of the forecasts, actually the fairly near-term forecasts. This is in thousands of megawatts, so not a huge amount, but you can see it start ramping up fairly quickly now over the next few years. This is showing air source heat pump penetration, and then electric vehicles on the darker bars. The dark blue bar is the winter peak effect from transportation, and the lighter blue bar is the summer peak. But of course, this is going to be a hockey stick. So this is just sort of the flat part of the hockey stick. It's going to have to really ramp up pretty quickly in the next 2 decades. So coming back to the 2050 transmission study, it goes all the way out to 2050, but it also looks at snapshots at 2035 and 2040. When we looked at 2050, half the existing transmission system is overloaded. So we know for sure that it cannot meet the loads that we're going to be putting on that system out in 2050. In fact, in order to make some sense of this, we have to back it down to 2035 and 2040 to just get a sense of where we need to go first. So the real point of the study is to try and inform the region, specifically the states, on the amount, type, and the high-level cost estimates of the transmission infrastructure that would be needed to meet these loads. And we've now enshrined this in our tariff. So we were the first ISO to sort of go out there and seek approval from the FERC and have this be part of our planning. And now we've got to work to connect this long-range planning, which is essentially economic studies, with the shorter-term transmission planning that we do in the 10-year time frame. And I'll come back to this in a minute, but we see the states as having a very strong decisional role in that. So before we go there, though, I just wanted to use this slide this slide shows you what happens to our winter peak and our summer peak. And it's very interesting. By 2030, roughly 2030, we shift to becoming a winter peaking system. And then that grows dramatically over time. Really driven by heating electrification mainly, but also transportation electrification. And so looking at that, we struggle. So that bar there's 35 gigawatts. That's about 22. When we're having these close calls in today's winter, like the winter of 17, 18, we're struggling to serve 22,000 megawatts of load in this region with today's system, right? Because of these energy adequacy constraints. So how are we going to do 35, 43, 57? It's a big question. So we can do it volumetrically by putting lots of renewables on the system, but we have to have a plan for when those renewables can't produce, because the system won't hold up unless we do that. And so I think we're not paying attention to this problem, and we need a plan to solve this problem. And I don't think the market on its own is going to solve this problem, not the way it's structured at the moment. So 2050 transmission study, some key takeaways. I think I've covered most of it. Shift from summer peaking to winter peaking. The load generation balance shows that we're going to need some fossil all the way through to the end. So, we just need to be realistic. That's likely to be gas. The fossil resource is going to be gas. And way out in 2050, maybe we're converting some of that to green hydrogen. But gas is around for a while, and we need to make sure that it's reliable. And the last point here really about transmission. The big transmission investments, if you sort of think about what's needed, there's a lot of transmission needed in order to integrate the offshore wind and bring it into the demand centers, particularly in lower, sort of southern New England. We also need to strengthen the north-south interface and then the interfaces with New York. And probably in that order, if you think about it, just in terms of the priorities. So the next step really on this study is to start looking at possible transmission solutions. We think collaboration with the states is vitally important because in the end they represent the consumers who are going to pay for this, and they control permitting and siting. So there's no way we get this done without the states. And so they need to be a part of the solution. It's not something we should bring to them at the end of the process. They have to be involved right up front, and preferably actually giving guidance and having the ability to steer the investment. And that's much easier said than done in a 6-state region where every state is a sovereign entity. So it's got to be that the states work together. I mentioned that FERC now, in this past February, approved our long-range scenario-based transmission analysis. And we're looking forward to obviously working with all the regional stakeholders in the states to turn that into reality. And really my concluding points here, I'll just run through them quickly. I've said it a lot of times during the course of this presentation. We have to ensure energy adequacy, otherwise the system is going to fail. what that means is we've got to retain enough existing infrastructure and stabilize the fuel supply chains and have a plan for transitioning that energy input into something other than fossil fuels. And when I look to Europe and to Japan, they're much further ahead, I think, in terms of thinking about this seriously. So green hydrogen is the thing that they're looking at in both Japan as well as in Europe. I know it's expensive to store, but it's going to take a long time to build that infrastructure out. And we've got to get started at some point to make that happen. This point over here really is that we've got vast renewable energy potential. So we've got the natural resources to be able to do this. It's about connecting it up, which is where transmission comes into it again. And ultimately, I know this is what you folk talk about, but this is a great time to be a transmission developer. So, and I look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gordon. Yeah, I really do like the bold on the last bullet you've got there. You're kind of preaching to the choir on that point. Really appreciate hearing your perspective. And this is a good time for folks if hopefully you have some questions. I think Gordon's willing to take a few of them and follow up.
Sure. Good morning.
Thank you, Gordon. My name is George Sassine from NYSERDA. You have a bullet point here about transmission around cost allocation, and I was wondering, what are your thoughts around that topic, and how do we fund, these transmission investments? Because, frankly, we're here in New York, where one of the big hurdles for us is getting the Public Service Commission to approve these projects, given the sensitivity of ratepayer impacts and how that might look like.
It's really interesting to hear that from somebody inside of New York, which is a single state. I don't have any wisdom to offer from a single state perspective. It really comes down to the state agreeing to do it, because how does the governor of New York and any other policymaker in New York commit to massive decarbonization goals and not commit to transmission? There's something that doesn't add up there. So there's no way they're going to meet those goals unless they make the investments in transmission and find a way to cost allocate them. The same is true. The same logic is true here in New England, but it's more complicated because you have to have 6 states agree on the cost allocation methodology. And what we've learned through Order 1000 is that FERC is not going to solve that problem, right? So Order 1000 gave the region a cost allocation methodology. It was the inverse of what the states wanted. I mean, the ISO said to the FERC at the time, here's a cost allocation methodology. The beneficiary is going to pick up 70% or 75%. The other states are going to pick up the balance. FERC flipped that. We said at the time to the FERC, the states need to be in the lead in terms of making the decisions, and the FERC flipped that as well and said, no, the ISO's in charge. And the consequence was we've never used Order 1000 public policy transmission in our tariff, right? And so I think the learning from that experience is the states have to be in control. And because they are in control, I hear a lot of people talking about federal preemption and this and that. I don't believe it's going to work. I think it'll just be a big fight. It'll end up in the courts. People will find a way to block it. So if you can block it, if the industry, the marketplace can spend $100 million blocking a transmission line up in Maine, locally, what do you think is going to happen if the federal government's trying to ram transmission through states? I think it's going to go nowhere. So the very states that are making the laws that will require us to decarbonize are also the states that have to help us get the transmission built. And they have to help us solve the siting and the permitting challenges. So, one thing that's always been in the background here is, how do you make sure this transmission investment is cost effective? because there's a lot of skepticism around the folk in this room actually doing this cost effectively, and there's always this fear that transmission developers are going to gold plate their systems because that's a good way to make a return. And that problem hasn't been completely solved. I mean, partly the problem was, the part of this solution to the problem was this idea of competition. But that I don't think has worked that well either. And I think there's an adverse effect around competition, which is it drives developers to try and connect the transmission and have in places where it's most cost effective from the perspective of just delivering the energy, but under a minimum interconnection standard. So that creates a problem in the long run, because you end up getting the transmission interconnections in less desirable places. Too far north, for example, where the energy will still be bottlenecked because there will be other renewables on the system. So I think we need to have a more realistic view on where to make the transmission interconnection. We're building for the next 100 years here. So it really need to plan this out in a way that we are not just trying to minimize the cost in the short run by connecting to the cheapest point that we can find, but not thinking about whether that's going to be the right point in the long run. I think that's a big dimension to this as well. The other thing is we have to be realistic about siting and permitting, that it's going to cost some money to get through that process. So the fixed price model drives the wrong incentives in my view as well. I would rather see a big contingency in the project and say to the transmission developers, okay, give us your best estimate, give us your estimate on the contingency you're going to need in order to get through the siting and permitting process, because you're going to have to buy your way through that somehow, right? And what we'll do is we'll share the contingency. If you can find your way through the siting and permitting process and get that line connected, we'll give you half, and consumers will get half. And that way you've set up an incentive for people to go work the system. But if you set it up in a manner that says, give me your fixed price deal and I'm putting you in competition with 3 other people, you're going to get a set of incentives where people are going to sharpen their pencil and give you the lowest possible estimate. They're going to make unrealistic assumptions, and then they're going to hit the siting and permitting process, and they're not going to have the money to buy the way through the siting and permitting process. And so then they'll fight, right? And then the whole thing falls apart. So I think, and we need so much transmission. There's also, as I was thinking about this, you may want to run 2 projects in parallel for a while, just to see which one is going to be feasible. Before you choose one before you start building them, but you actually, put 2 projects through. You put them through a bake-off, but not a paper bake-off. You actually get them far along, or maybe you pick 2, one of which you think you can wait on for the longer run. But we have to be realistic. There's a probability that these projects are going to stall, and that's exactly what we've ended up with here in New England, because we've made a whole bunch of decisions on the assumption that certain projects are going to be in place, or certain offshore wind farms are going to be in place, and we've let stuff go, and now they haven't arrived. And so how do you manage that problem?
Sorry, Alex Stern, PSEG, and you just teed up a huge amount. I wanted to go back to slide 16 and just layer in, I think it was slide 15 or 16, but layer in one key other point. So you talked about planning for 100 years, the clunkiness that competition is bringing to the problem, because you're just going to have everybody fighting. But then you talk about the desire for more long-term scenario planning, and we're doing a forecast here out to 2050. I like your idea of a bake-off, but even when you bat 300, you're making out 7 out of 10 times. So this may be right, but it may not be right. And if we're going to build or we're going to have people doing a bake-off, the certainty that's going to be required to know that if people are going to be working through and constructing or at least doing engineering, capturing back their costs if the scenario doesn't happen, if it doesn't become used and useful, if the electric vehicles don't arrive, if the lines that are built aren't entirely proven out to be necessary because of the way things evolved. How do we go about getting the certainty from the regulators, both federal and state, to actually do the build that the scenario planning is telling us we better do? And they all seem to want us to prepare for the next 100 years. I agree with you, but then they keep setting up signals that really they want us to prepare for the next 6 months. So,
yeah, I mean, difficult. I agree with your concern. I think a large part of the solution is the states have to sign off on the build-out. Because if you don't have the states sign off on the build-out, and we're not going to build it all at once, it's going to be a piece at a time. So, if that picture doesn't materialize by 2050, we're not going to have made all the investments in 2029, right? So you'll never do it that way. You're going to be doing it a piece at a time. So you'll start putting in place the transmission investments to hit the 2035 goal. And that'll be huge. And if we're just targeting, let's say, reducing our dependency on LNG, in addition to what's needed for decarbonization, I mean, that is just, to me, a good strategic investment for the region, because you're taking care of two problems at once. You have to get lots of renewables on to hit the decarbonization goals, and to the extent that you can reduce the dependency on imported LNG, that's a win as well. So then, to your question about how do you get the cost recovery, the FERC creates the opportunity. I mean, we spend $13 billion, that's going to get cost recovery. People fight about what the rate of return should be, but it's getting cost recovery. I think looking forward, though, in order to not have the second guessing, we need to make sure the states are part of the decision making to sign off on the next wave of investment. I don't think there should be a federally driven decision making process. You have to make it local, because they're going to have to pay for it and they have to own it, and they have to make sure that we get the siting and permitting done. I don't see any way around that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Gordon. Really appreciate hearing your perspective. You've gotten us off to a great start here for our meeting. I think you gave people a heck of a lot to think about, if nothing else. And so glad to hear you solved all these issues up here in New England and provide a roadmap for us.